An incredible weekend of college football turns sour as maybe the biggest controversy in the history of college football unfolded Sunday afternoon. Florida State, a 13-0 undefeated ACC champion, was left out of the playoffs for a 12-1 Alabama team. And that's how we're going to lead off today's video. But with the intro out of the way, I'd like to say hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan. And today we're going to be recapping the conference championship weekend, starting with Florida State versus Louisville. Before we talk about the outside stuff, let's talk about the game here for a little bit. Florida State's defense put on maybe the best defensive performance of any team in the country in the season so far. Louisville came into this game averaging 5.2 yards per play. They averaged in this game 2.7. They came in averaging more than 30 points. They scored 6. Jared Verse proved why he is going to be a top 10 pick, as he was the best player on the field from the first snap to the last. The third string quarterback struggled. He couldn't make basic reads, and he also didn't understand how to throw the ball away. But he didn't make the big mistake, which Jack Plummer did, throwing that interception in the end zone. Florida State was clearly the better football team from the beginning of the game to the end. They deserved to win, they deserved to be ACC champions, and they deserve to be in the playoff. The major takeaway from this 2023-2024 season for Florida State is that winning doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you went 13-0 and beat a very good group of teams. It doesn't matter that the ACC was a better conference this year than the SEC. It doesn't matter that they dominated most of their games. It doesn't matter that they beat LSU by more than what Alabama did. It doesn't matter that they were ranked 4 spots ahead of Alabama heading into this week. None of that matters. All that matters is that Alabama will pull more TV ratings than FSU. Florida State got shafted the worst of any team or individual in the history of college football. Florida State deserves to be in the playoff more than Alabama does. Full stop. There is no argument to be had that Florida State should be behind Alabama. It does not exist. Florida State showed more consistency throughout this season than Alabama did. And when they struggled against better teams than Alabama struggled against. Boston College is better than Auburn. Clemson is better than Arkansas. Miami is better than Texas A&M, and showed so on the field when they won by double digits. Florida State scored more points against LSU while giving up less. They have been, from the first game of the season all the way through the conference championship game, the better and more consistent team. So outside of recruiting rankings and an extraordinarily subjective thing known as the eye test, there is no reason why Alabama should be number 4 and Florida State shouldn't be in. And before you say that expanding the playoffs would have solved this problem, I would like to remind you that in the 9 4-team college football playoffs, this is the first time that more than 4 teams actually had a case to make the playoff. In fact, in most years, you could barely find 3 teams that deserved to make the playoff, because the vast majority of the time in the history of college football, there are only really 2 teams that can win the national title. And this year has been extraordinary, and it's been special, and it's been weird. But this is the outlier of outliers, as there are 6, maybe even 7 teams that legitimately could have won the national title. If you think that's going to happen consistently in the 12-team playoff, you are wrong. Because even in this year, where we have those 6 or 7 teams, there are only 4 that deserve to be in. And Alabama is not one of them. Those 4 teams are Michigan, Washington, Texas, and Florida State. Florida State did everything that they were supposed to do. Alabama didn't. But because of the playoff committee's biased decision to say that Florida State is not one of the 4 best teams, despite a mountain of evidence to suggest otherwise, they are left out of the college football playoff, and they do not have a chance to actually win the national title, even though they damn well could have won it, even without Jordan Travis, because they have an elite caliber defense and a great offensive line with an elite running back. And if the quarterback can game manage their way to victory, they easily could have won the national championship. But because of mainly TV ratings and partially an SEC bias, they were robbed of that opportunity. I hope, for the good of college football, that Florida State manages to beat Georgia and prove that they should have been in the playoff. Moving on to the SEC Championship game, I predicted Georgia to win this game mainly because I thought they would, and I thought that they matched up much better against Alabama than Alabama did against them. And that was partially true. However, Jalen Milroe turned into the quarterback that we all thought he had the potential to be, and established himself as firmly a top 3 quarterback in college football this year. Those runs to end the game are the stuff that legends are made of, and Jalen Milroe rightfully has written his name into Alabama lore as a legend. If it wasn't enough last week on the Hail Mary, there was certainly enough this week. And for Georgia, this season is categorically a failure. You were undeniably the best team in the country heading into conference championship weekend. You had a quarterback playing like a top 10 pick, an elite receiving core, an elite offensive line, and a great to elite caliber defense with the best secondary in the country. You left opportunities out on the field, whether it be through questionable play calling decisions or missed opportunities. You very easily could have won this game. But could have doesn't mean anything if you're the caliber of program that Georgia is. I think Carson Beck is better than Stetson Bennett. I think you have a better receiving core than the past 2 years. The only spot where you don't compare to previous iterations is the front 7. And that being said, it's still probably a top 10 unit in college football. Ultimately, this is one of those games where you kind of have to shake your head and say, we didn't win, oh well. In a normal season, you still would have been in the playoffs and probably would have had a very good chance to win the national title. Next season, you might be resting starters in this game because the championship game won't mean a damn thing. So keep your head high if you're a Georgia fan. You're still the best program in the country, and you're still a national championship caliber team. The Big Ten championship game, unlike the SEC championship game, went exactly like everybody thought it was going to go. Iowa struggled to move the ball. They had multiple turnovers and probably could have had more. Michigan played an extraordinarily conservative and borderline disrespectful offensive game plan where they were playing seniors and 6th and 7th string offensive skill position players because they knew that the second they scored a touchdown, the game was over. For Iowa, this season was a success. Your offense is inept. However, there is hope with Brian Ferentz walking off into the sunset, probably to coach in Division III football for a while. So if you can manage to get yourself an actual offensive coordinator capable of calling a competent offense, your offense will never be explosive or elite. I'm sorry to tell you that because your defense is so good. And if you did have an explosive or elite offense, then your defense would not be as good as it is currently. And Kurt Ferentz will always prioritize the defense. So the best that you can hope for is a Michigan style of offense where the quarterback is very efficient and experienced and can get the job done with a few key passes and completions while the running game does the majority of the work. And as a program, you should be able to find that. This may be your last Big Ten championship game for a while, as Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA are all set to join the conference next year. However, this is still a very good and very consistent program with one of the best head coaches in college football. For Michigan, you have to prepare for a matchup against Alabama now. This game was a formality, a business trip. You didn't particularly need to do a whole lot or show a whole lot in order to be the #1 ranked team in the country heading into the playoffs and the general favorite to win the national title. And to be quite honest with you, you probably should win the national title. Alabama has several exploitable things, which we will talk about in a future video breaking down that game, and you match up very favorably against either Washington or Texas. Your focus should now be the game coming up in the Rose Bowl, which you are favored to win. In the final game of the Pac-12, Washington managed to hold on. They proved me wrong. I thought Oregon was clearly a better football team. In fact, I predicted them to win by 10 points. However, I didn't anticipate or account for a simple fact of reality, which is Oregon was playing to get into the playoffs, and Washington was playing to beat Oregon. That is to say that much like Michigan versus Ohio State the past few years, one team was playing to beat the other, and the other team was playing for something else. And that focus for Washington is what separated them in the first matchup and this matchup. When Michael Penix had the ball at the end of the game with a chance to win it, he delivered. The Washington run game showed up consistently against a Oregon defensive line that I felt had a clear advantage against the Washington offensive line. And the wide receiving core, specifically Rome Odunze, showed up and showed out. Having McMillan back was a big deal, as he provided several big plays throughout the game that helped Washington win. Rome Odunze, I believe, solidified himself as the wide receiver 2 of this upcoming class, and Michael Penix Jr. showed why he probably should be a first-round pick as well. For Oregon, it's time to look in the mirror. Something isn't working right. Your rival, and in the 2 biggest games of the season, you couldn't get it done. You had the opportunities to win the game in both of these matchups, and the defense disappointed. Dan Lanning is going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure out what is going wrong in these games and how he can fix it, because you have the talent on offense and defense to have won the national title this year. But instead, you're 11-1 and playing Liberty in the Fiesta Bowl. Now, you'll beat Liberty probably something like 56-7, but that doesn't really mean a whole lot. You as a program should have your expectations set higher. This year was a failure. You have maybe a first-round pick at quarterback, several great offensive playmakers who won't be back next year, an award candidate along the offensive line, and a first-round talent on the defensive line to go along with great players everywhere else. However, for this reason or that reason, when the lights shined the brightest, you didn't show up. For the rest of college football, the games went like this. Texas had Oklahoma beat by halfway through the first quarter. That game was over. Oklahoma State only scored 21 points and probably shouldn't have even scored that much. Boise State made me look like an ass for picking UNLV in a very close game, as they proved that they were significantly a better team. SMU beat a Tulane team that didn't look like they particularly wanted to play football. Liberty surprised with a 2-touchdown win over New Mexico State, and Miami of Ohio enacted their revenge on Toledo. Before the championship game that shouldn't have been, Troy beating App State 49-23, when it should have been Troy versus James Madison. Now, maybe Troy would have won. However, James Madison still should have been in this game. They got lucky enough to be able to go bowling, but the postseason ban remains an idiotic rule. And now the playoffs are set. Michigan at 1, Washington at 2, Texas at 3, and Alabama at 4. I don't particularly think that these are the 4 best teams in the country, as I have already discussed in the Florida State section of this video. However, none of that matters. I don't get to decide who makes the playoffs. I just get to bitch about it afterwards. But reality is what it is. Michigan will play Alabama, and Washington will play Texas in what should be 2 very close and very entertaining games. Expect videos on those 2 games coming at some point in the future. However, today we are going to talk about them a little bit, and we're going to be ranking these 4 teams position by position to try and figure out who is potentially the best team. And we're going to start with the quarterback position. When it comes to that position, the quarterback position, I have them ranked as such. Number 1, Alabama. Number 2, Washington. Number 3, Texas. And number 4, Michigan. Yes, I think J.J. McCarthy is the worst college quarterback of the 4 that are in the playoffs. That being said, he is not bad by any means. In fact, I think he's a good to great quarterback and probably ranked somewhere between 15 and 10 of all quarterbacks in the country. I think Quinn Ewers, Michael Penix Jr., and Jalen Milroe are all top 10 quarterbacks in the country, though. So I think this is pretty clearly the correct order. Jalen Milroe has been absolutely fantastic since the offense kind of figured out that he's really good at throwing the deep ball. Michael Penix has had a few stinker of games. However, overall, he's been an elite caliber quarterback. Quinn Ewers has also been up and down. However, when the team has needed him the most, he's delivered. J.J. McCarthy has not thrown for more than 200 yards against a team that has a pulse. I still think he's a very good and very efficient quarterback. However, he is not in the same league as the 3 above him. Conversely, Michigan has the best set of running backs of any team in the playoff. If Brooks was healthy, Texas would have a case. However, I do not believe that they have much of a case without him. Blake Corum is very, very good. However, the offensive line has kind of let him down this year. Texas's stable of running backs have been great without Brooks and exceeded my expectations. However, they are not the same caliber of group without him. Alabama's running backs are okay. Jace McMillan is good, Rondell Williams is okay, and they do have a talented young freshman. However, he didn't particularly do a whole lot, and I don't know how good he is. Washington may have a good running back, which I believe they do. However, they do not compare to the rest of these groups. However, again, in quite the opposite fashion, they have the best group of wide receivers and tight ends by a mile. They have a top 10 pick in Rome Odunze, in my opinion. They have another first-round caliber player in McMillan, and another top 40 or 50 pick in Polk, to go along with a high-quality tight end who, although he isn't the best tight end in this group, is still very good. Texas is at number 2. Xavier Worthy is perhaps a first-round pick. A.D. Mitchell, I think, is likely going to go in the back end of the second round or early in the third. However, he is a tremendous football player. And Jatavian Sanders at tight end is probably the second best tight end in the country. To go along with some other solid options in the receiving game, Texas slots in at number 2. Alabama and Michigan is closer than you might think. However, Jermaine Burton puts Alabama over the top. Nye Black is solid, Bond is okay, and they have few other options that inspire much confidence. However, Michigan has no options that inspire confidence against any defense with a pulse. Colston Loveland is good, very good even, and potentially a first-round pick. He's probably the second best tight end of these 4 teams. However, you do not have another player that would start or be in the 2 deep for either of these other 3 teams. This was perhaps the easiest decision to put a team at 4 in the entire categories of these teams. Michigan's receiving corps has been a problem throughout the season, and it will likely continue to be a problem. Moving on to the offensive line, by a razor-thin margin, I have Alabama at 1, Michigan at 2, and then a bit of a gap to Texas, and then a bit of a gap to Washington. Washington's offensive line is good. It's probably a top 20 unit in the country. Texas is probably a top 20 unit in the country as the same. However, I would give them a slight edge because I think they're better at run blocking than Washington. However, Michigan versus Alabama was the tough decision here. And I know some Michigan fans in the comments are going to say that Michigan has a better offensive line than Alabama. And if they were healthy, I would agree with you. So I'm going to take you through my thought process here. At left tackle, I have a clear advantage for Michigan. Ladarius Henderson is good, and Caden Proctor at times this year has been straight up a liability. At left guard, I'm going to give the advantage to Alabama. At center, I'm going to give the advantage to Michigan. Drake Nugent has been one of the 3 or 4 best centers in college football. At right guard, I would have given the advantage to Michigan with Zach Zinter. However, with Carson Barnhart playing at right guard, I don't see the same level of play. And because of that, I'm going to give the right guard position to Alabama. And at right tackle, J.C. Latham is a first-round caliber player, and Carson Barnhart / Trente Jones are not nearly as good as him. So by a slim 3-2 margin, I did have to give the edge to Alabama. But it was a very, very close call, and if Zach Zinter had not tragically gotten hurt with a season-ending leg injury against Ohio State, I would say that you have the best offensive line of anybody in the playoffs. The defensive line was similarly close. I have Michigan at number 1, Alabama at number 2, Texas at number 3, and Washington at number 4. I think Washington is fairly clearly a little bit lower than everybody else here. Braylon Trice is very, very good. However, the rest of the defensive line does not stack up to the other 3 groups. Texas is very good and has a ton of depth. They can legitimately go 8 to 9 deep without having a drop-off in play. However, they do not, in my opinion, have the same high level of edge play as the next 2 teams above them. I think T'Vondre Sweat is tremendously good and maybe even a first-round pick. However, the edges are good, not great, whereas I think Alabama and Michigan have similar levels of interior talent, perhaps for Alabama a little bit worse, but significantly better edge play and talent. When it comes down to Michigan versus Alabama, it really did come down to the fact that I do think Michigan is deeper and just might have more NFL talent than Alabama. I think Alabama has Dallas Turner, who is a first-round pick. As an edge rusher, Broswell has been playing very, very good as well. However, right now, I don't think he's a first-round type of player. I think Chris Jenkins, in a weaker defensive tackle class like this year, could sneak his way into the back end of the first round. And I think Michigan might have 2 first-round caliber interior guys in the 2025 class in Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham, while having multiple day 2 caliber edge rushers in Jalen Harrell, Josiah Stewart, and potentially a guy like Derek Moore, who I believe actually has the potential to rise into the first round discussion with a good performance next year. So just because of the sheer quantity of talent that Michigan has along the defensive line, I am giving Michigan the edge. The linebacking core, I think, was also fairly easy. I think Texas is fairly clearly the worst, not to say that they're bad, but I think they're okay to good. I don't particularly think they're great or elite. Alabama has some very talented linebackers, but they have been playing extraordinarily consistently, and Lawson, arguably their best player, has straight up consistently been a liability when asked to drop in coverage. Meanwhile, Washington's 2 linebackers, one of which whose name I can't pronounce, and don't wish to insult by attempting to pronounce it, that's number 5 for them. He's very, very good. He might be the best coverage linebacker in the country. That he and his partner are better than the Michigan pair of linebackers, Mike Barrett and Junior Colson, although it is close. I also think that a differentiating factor might be that Ernest Hausman, the third sort of linebacker for Michigan, is significantly better than either of the backup linebackers that Washington plays. So I am going to say that Michigan does have the best linebacking core of the final four teams. The final group here is the defensive backs. And while all of these units are very, very good, Alabama and Michigan's, I think, are a tier above Texas and Washington. Starting with Texas and Washington, ultimately, the reason why I have Texas above Washington is because I believe Texas's secondary is a bit more consistent than Washington's. Thompson and Barron, to go along with Malik Muhammad and Gavin Holmes, have been very consistent to me this year, and Washington's secondary has been a little bit more up and down. Jabbar Muhammad has at times looked like an elite player, and at times also not particularly played all that well. While Elijah Jackson and Thaddeus Dixon, I don't particularly think have played at a very high level this year. As far as the safeties go, Hampton and Powell have been okay, but again, not particularly playing at a high level. I just think Texas is a little bit better than Washington here. Now, I do think that there is a significant gap between Texas and Michigan in this ranking here. I think you can make the case that Alabama and Michigan are both top three, with Georgia secondaries in the country. And I think that likely is the case. It's probably, in my opinion, Georgia 1, Alabama 2, and Michigan 3. And ultimately, it was the safety play that kind of separated these two groups for me. I think you can make a comparison between Michigan's corners in terms of like their top three, Sanderstill in the slot, Wallace and Johnson on the outside, and Alabama's top three with Arnold, McKinstry, and Amos. Now, I do think probably McKinstry is the best in that group, and we would have to have a serious conversation between Terrion Arnold and Will Johnson in terms of who's better. I think right now, based off of this year, it's very close, but I would just kind of barely give it to Will Johnson. I then think Arnold would slot into the third position of the group, with Sanders still slotting in 4 and Josh Wallace 5, Trey Amos 6, in terms of ranking those top three corners / slot guys for these two teams. However, when it comes to safety play, there is a clear advantage. Caleb Downs has been one of the best safeties in the country. Malachi Moore has been solid in the slot, although I do think Mike Sanders still has been better. And Jalen Key has also been very, very good. Now, Michigan's two safeties, in terms of the starting safeties, they do rotate significantly more than Alabama, but their two starting guys, Rod Moore and McCorry Page, haven't particularly shown me a whole lot this year. I think they're both good, and the film kind of backs that up. Now, if we were taking depth into account here, which you can argue I should, then I think Michigan might have an edge. But when it comes to just the starting players, and this isn't the D-line where you do rotate consistently, Michigan does not rotate consistently in the secondary as nearly as much as they do along the defensive line. So I'm really just going to talk about the starting guys here. And when it comes to the starters, I do think Caleb Downs kind of pushes Alabama over the top, though it is tremendously close. So if we were to take everybody's position here when we're going position by position and their ranking and add them up, these are the totals. Alabama has 14 points, and obviously the lowest number would be the best number because you want to be number 1 in the rankings. And then Michigan would be number 2 with 15, Texas would be number 3 with 20, and Washington would be number 4 with 21. And in terms of an overall talent index, I do think that that is about right. I think Michigan and Alabama are close, with maybe a slight edge to Alabama, and I think Texas and Washington are close to each other, but a little bit more distant between Alabama and Michigan. And this kind of goes to show what my actual opinion here is, which is that whoever wins the Rose Bowl, Alabama or Michigan, also probably wins the national title. I think Texas and Washington, in terms of matchups, match up kind of bad with Michigan, and Alabama would have a very fun matchup against Washington, but I think would have the revenge factor against Texas and probably win. But that's just me, and what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. It's at this point I'd like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagree with me at any point, or you just have something to say, go ahead and hop down in the comment section below and leave me a comment. So with the outro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.